John with Kahira the Orphan Guard, playing Azorius control. Tai on the left, Golgari Citadel. The players roll off, Tai elects to go first and draws his initial 7, as does John. Both players decide they don't like their initial 7, toss it back, going down to a mulligan of 6. Tai decides he likes his mulligan of 6 and decides to toss one to the bottom, and John joins him at 6, tossing one to the bottom himself. Tai develops Llanowar Wastes and takes 1 to play Elvish Mystic. He then passes the turn. John untaps, decides taking damage for the weak, and plays a tapped Hallowed Fountain, passing it back. Tai then attacks for 1 with his Elvish Mystic, and John takes it, going down to 19. Tai then goes down to 18 himself to play another Llanowar Elves and reveals he has a bit of a land problem, a little bit of a land shortage. John decides to untap and play a Hallowed Fountain untapped, joining Tai at 18. John passes back, Tai untaps, and decides that he is going to get frisky with both elves and attack in for 2, playing an overgrown tomb post-combat. Tai then tries to develop a Zulaport Cutthroat, and John decides to make him disappear rather than deal with the problem. John untaps, looks over his hand, does not get a land, passes the turn. Tai draws, thinks it over, attacks in for 2 again, no fear. He then decides to tap 2 and play Vran, Executioner Thane. John decides to use the power of literacy. He thinks about if he wants to let Vran resolve, and he does. John then shocks himself with a 3rd Hallowed Fountain, going down, and decides to play Temporary Lockdown for a one-sided board wipe. He passes back, Tai untaps with his Lair of the Hydra. On the field, he plays Catacomb Sifter, developing the Sifter and a 1/1 Eldrazi token. Tai then adds an Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth to the field as his land for the turn and passes back to John. John thinks over his hand for a moment, trying to think if he wants to keep responses open. He then uses Literacy on Catacomb Sifter and passes back the turn. Tai is a fan of cowboy magic. He immediately fires up his Lair of the Hydra, not interested in playing into counterspells, and decides that shoving his 5 damage into the opponent's face is absolutely the correct play. John decides to respond with a March of Otherworldly Light, sending Tai's Lair of the Hydra on an otherworldly parade, and he Fateful Absences the Catacomb Sifter, taking just 1 damage, although netting Tai a clue. Once the damage has resolved, John decides to untap as Tai has passed the turn, and he looks at his hand of removal and counterspells and decides to cast Narset, Parter of Veils. Narset resolves, and John decides to draw 4 cards and see what he decides to keep, and he goes for another March of Otherworldly Light for his Parade of Removal. John passes the turn back, Tai untaps, attacks in for 1 at Narset, threatening her death if she tries to activate again, and then attempts to resolve a Catacomb Sifter. John gives the OK go, and another Eldrazi token joins the Sifter on the field. John finds his 3rd land in the form of a Glacial Fortress. He stops and thinks for a moment if he wants to wrath this board with a Supreme Verdict, and he absolutely does. Tai decides to sacrifice both Eldrazi tokens, to scry twice, and then draw a card, letting only the Sifter die for any sort of value. John decides to look over the board, thinks that the turn is safe. However, as he sacrifices Narset, he stops and finds a Wandering Emperor on his Travails, and then he puts everything else to the bottom. Tai, at the end of his turn, ambushes him with a Boseiju Who Endures, getting back 3 of his creatures and creating a board where John thought that there was none. Tai draws for the turn, sends 4 into the red zone, and lowers John's life total just that much further. John decides to untap, draw, passes back with Wandering Emperor mana up. Tai, not interested in playing into the Wandering Emperor, just attacks for 2. Not putting his Vran tapped and leaving it exposed to the Emperor's removals. Instead, John just decides to play the Emperor, and he develops a Samurai. The Samurai moves to block 1 of the elves, and John takes 3 for his trouble thanks to Vran's trigger, and Tai gains 2 thanks to Vran's trigger. Post-combat, Tai thinks over for a moment, and then decides to develop a Priest of Forgotten Gods, praying that John does not have another supreme verdict. John taps and draws, and decides instead to play a March of Otherworldly Light, targeting Vran, and exiling it, pitching a Farewell to the Otherworldly Light's effect. He develops another Samurai and swings in for 2. Tai takes 2. Tai untaps and draws. John creates a 1/1 shark token at the end of Tai's turn, draws a card. He then puts his counter on it, untaps, draws for the turn. Sporting now 5 power on board. Finally, John decides to play Teferi, Hero of Dominaria. He's going to plus Teferi to draw a card, and 2 lands will untap during his end step. John thinks it over for a moment before buffing one of his Samurai, making it a 3/3 to join the 1/1 and 2/2, and then he swings in. Tai reminds John that sharks are ferocious, but they do not have vigilance, and Tai takes the damage, dropping down to 11 life. John passes the turn, Tai untaps, draws, thinks for a moment, and then decides to play Vran Executioner Thane. John plays Makes Disappear, trying to get rid of the Aristocrat, but he knows he's going to have to sacrifice the shark. However, even with 2 copies of Make Disappear, Tai has the mana to play it, and Tai stops, thinks for a moment, and then activates Priest of Forgotten Gods, layering his triggers so that Vran sees the elf die and triggers his effect first before the priest finishes hers, dealing 4 damage to John. Sideboarding, Tai brings Thought Distortion, Reclamation Sage, Duress ×2, Invoke Despair, and on the other side, John brings out Regal Caracoles ×2, Farewell ×2, and Temporary Lockdown ×2, since it was so good in the first game, despite the Boseiju at the end. Both players then draw their initial 7, John reveals his Kahira, and we are underway for game 2. John, on the play, decides to play a Hallowed Fountain tapped. Tai simply plays a Deathcap Glade and passes back. John then plays a Glacial Fortress untapped thanks to the island/plains beside it, and Tai taps 1, making an elf, and lays another Deathcap Glade down and passes the turn. John untaps, decides that he is going to tap for 1 and lay down arms on the militaristic elf, gaining Tai 3 life. Tai untaps and draws, with his mana a little bit stunted, and looks over his hand for a moment before deciding to play a Vran Executioner Thane. John thinks it over for a moment, and then allows it. John untaps, draws, finds his 4th land for the turn in a Prairie Stream. He taps 3 and puts Kahira into his hand, feeling very safe. Tai untaps, attacks for 2, putting John down to 18, dealing the first blood of the game. Tai develops another elf to try and get his mana problem solved. John untaps, plays his 5th land for the turn, thinks over what could go wrong for a moment, and then decides the answer is absolutely nothing and just passes back Memory Deluge at the front of his hand and ready to be used. Tai stops thinking about an Emperor for just a moment, and then finally decides to attack for 2. John takes the 2, no fear in his heart, and Tai then thinks for a little bit longer before tapping for 2, 3, and playing out a Catacomb Sifter. John decides to let the Sifter resolve, and an Eldrazi spawn is born into this world. John then taps 4, resolving a Memory Deluge, looking at the top 4 and picking 2 of the cards. He decides to put 2 lands into his hand, and the rest to the bottom, a true control player selection. John then lets it resolve, and he goes to his draw step. John plays his 6th land for the turn, takes a look at the board of wide creatures, some of which represent Tai's mana, and decides to farewell the board, exiling all creatures, all graveyards, and naming all artifacts and enchantments just for the flex. Tai decides to sack the Eldrazi token in response, dealing 2 to John, gaining to himself, getting a scry trigger from the Catacomb Sifter before all of his creatures hit the bin. Farewell finishes resolving, John puts it into the graveyard, Ty untaps, and looking at his mana problems, decides that he needs to play a Prosperous Innkeeper and get a temporary mana in the form of a treasure. John untaps, looks over his hand, plays Castle Ardenvale, and then taps 3 for Kahira, leaving open responses, and also getting down a 3/2 lifelinking blocker / Lord for his cat plan. Ty thinks for just a moment, plays his 3rd land for the turn, and passes back with 4 mana open. What could it possibly be? John doesn't care what it could possibly be, because he decides just to play down Regal Caracoles, which outsize most of Ty's creatures thanks to Kahira and the Caracol card itself. John then decides to swing in with a 4/3 Kahira thanks to the Regal Caracoles. Ty plays a very surprising Collected Company in response before blocks, and proceeds to look through the top of his cards, resolves a Woe Strider and a Priest of Forgotten Gods, gaining himself 3 life, and resolving the rest of the Collected Company and sending it to the bin. We are still in the middle of blocks. Ty decides to go block with the goat. However, he sacks the goat before damage is dealt, getting a scry trigger and preventing John from gaining life. John thinks over the situation about what he needs to remove, if anything, and decides that the board is pretty well under control, and so he simply goes for a Otherworldly Light, pitching a temporary lockdown to exile one of Ty's more dangerous sacrificial enablers in the form of the Woe Strider. Going back to Ty's turn, he thinks for a moment, and then decides to play down a land tapped, Blooming Marsh, and tries to resolve a Vran Executioner Thane, going full-on Aristocrats for his Dex Plan B. Still no sign of the Golgari Citadel that it is named for. John goes ahead and plays his umpteenth land for the turn, moves his Memory Deluge to the front, leaving his intentions without question as far as what he intends to potentially do with his mana, and then decides that attacking is absolutely the better part of Valor. So John swings in for 14, Ty looks it over for just a moment, decides that he's just going to block Kira with the Priest and the Innkeeper. John decides to cast Memory Deluge from his hand, looking at the top 4 cards again to see if he can blow Ty out with a removal spell. He does not find any. Resolves his Memory Deluge, taking 2, and then combat damage will resolve, with Kahira dying and the Priest and the Prosperous Innkeeper following her to the grave. Post-combat, John thinks it over, shifts his cats a little bit so that they're in nice parade marching order, and then it is back to Ty's turn. Ty plays another land for the turn and just leaves Vran there to try and hold the fort down. John decides to activate Castle Ardenvale, creating a 1/1 human token. While John is tapped out, Ty plays another Collected Company. Ty's Collected Company reveals 2 Zulaport Cutthroats. The life totals are about to swing up and down immensely. John goes to his turn, taps for 6, and plays Shark Typhoon. The end is nigh, and it is full of fins. Ty untaps nervously, draws for his turn, plays his 6th land for the turn. Is this the turn where he has Bolus the Citadel? No. Instead, it's just another Vran, threatening multiple triggers because the Vran will sack itself to the other Vran being on the board. John decides to absorb that and get a free shark out of it instead. Ty then tries to resolve his 3rd Zulaport Cutthroat just to make John a little less discouraged to attack him. Ty then proceeds to trash talk the cats, however John has no interest and instead just plays another Typhoon ridden with sharks and makes a 6/6 shark for his trouble and attacks for 3 in the air. Ty then goes ahead and heads to his turn. He decides to shock himself down to 15, no fear, and tries to resolve and invoke Despair, hoping to play around some form of counterspell, but he knows that he is likely dead here. John just goes ahead and pretends like he saw it coming, counters the Invoke Despair, makes another shark, and goes to his turn. John then quickly masks out the fact that Tyler is quite dead, and swings for lethal in the air with his shark army. Ty takes 15, and passes away. Going into Game 3, John tells Ty for the umpteenth time that he has Kahira. Tyler nods sagely, and then takes a look at his hand of 7. Both players decide to keep their 7. Ty opens with the Blooming Marsh and passes. John's turn. He plays a Prairie Stream tapped, passes back. Ty untaps, draws, plays out a Vrand Executioner Thane, a very familiar face at this point in the match. John plays Glacial Fortress, thinks it over for just a moment. If he wants to remove this Vrand now, he says no, that's not necessary. Ty then decides to swing in for 2, slapping John down to 18 with his Bear / Aristocrat. Ty then has 3 mana, plays Woe Strider. John thinks it over, decides to let it resolve. Ty's elation lasts all of 2 seconds, as John decides to March of Otherworldly Light the Woe Strider, getting rid of that sack enabler, and pitching farewell to his Otherworldly Light. Ty sacks the goat in response, dealing another 2 to John with Vrand's triggered ability, and gaining 2 for himself. Back to John's turn we go. He plays down an island, and looks over his hand, as control players are wont to do, and thinks that he's just going to pass, as control players are wont to do. Ty decides to be that aggression is the better part of valor, swings in for 2, hitting John for another 2, and just passes the turn back. John thinks that over for just a moment if he wants to kill that Vrand, says no, that's fine, plays down his 4th land for the turn, and passes back. Ty untaps, draws. Attacks for 2. John slams down an Emperor in response to the attack. Ty played a Collected Company, but all he got was a Priest of Forgotten Gods and a load of sadness. Vrand gets exiled, John gains 2, and puts the Emperor down on her loyalty to 2, leaving only a Priest of the Forgotten Gods, followed by a Shocked and Overgrown Tomb into a Llanowar Elf to face down the Troubadour of an Emperor. On John's turn, he taps through his mana a little bit, trying to decide the most efficient way to do his turn. He decides he does not need to rat this board, and instead just plays a Samurai and passes back, since it outsizes both of the threats. Ty ponders for just a moment, and then passes back. John plays a Shark Typhoon, or rather channels it, creating a 3/3 Shark token, which apparently is the only kind of Shark token that he makes. Then he decides to pump up his Samurai. This play looks very similar to earlier in the game, with 3/3 tokens for John. He then taps 1. And then attacks for 3 in the air. Ty decides to play Collected Company, and to clear Make Disappear mana and possible Absorb mana. John plays Makes Disappear without casualtying it, so Ty pays 2. John, forgetting that the elf exists there and admitting that, quickly decides that he has to do a little bit of damage control and counters it with Sod Coming. Ty untaps, and finally gets to slam the main namesake of his deck in the form of Bolas's Citadel. John lets out a death whistle as this awful occurrence has happened. Ty decides to start playing cards off the top of his deck. He resolves an Elvish Mystic. He plays a Duress, takes the board wipe from John's hand, plays a Nether Elf. The Bolas's Citadel is just getting absolutely out of control. And now we have a Woe Strider coming in and creating a goat for it to munch on later, just for snackies, you understand. And then Ty plays a land for the turn because he hasn't played a land for his turn yet. And John knows he is in massive trouble. Ty decides to activate the Priest from earlier that came off his Collected Company, floating to black mana, forcing John to sacrifice a creature, dealing 2 to John, and drawing him a card. Ty then looks at the card at the top of his deck, thinks it over for just a moment, thinks about if he wants to sacrifice any more of his board, and decides no, that is not the case. John decides to go to his turn, pump up the shark. The shark swings in, putting Ty down to 7. John then plays Fateful Absence onto the Woe Strider to prevent any more sack shenanigans, as has been his policy for the entire game. However, he gives Ty a clue for his trouble as to what happened to his Woe Strider. Ty plays his land for the turn from the top of his deck thanks to the Bolas' Citadel and the Lair of the Hydra. He then decides to attack the Emperor, putting her down to 1, so she will have to sacrifice herself or pump a token that's not going to be there because Ty sacks both elves, dealing 2 more to John, forcing him to sacrifice a creature, drawing himself a card, and generating 2 black mana. Ty then plays a Zulaport Cutthroat off the top of his deck, going down to just 5 health. However, Ty has no understanding of the word fear and decides to play another Woe Strider for the turn. Another Catacomb Sifter for the turn, going down to just 2. Definitely acknowledging that life total is a resource and his deck loves to play with its life total. John draws for the turn, thinks about everything for just a moment, and then finally just decides he's going to create a samurai with his Emperor rather than just let her die or try to pointlessly plus her, plus he has another in hand. John taps 4 to play another Wandering Emperor, exiling the Priest of Forgotten Gods, trying to stop Tyler from any more sacrifice shenanigans. He then taps 3 and plays Kahira, giving him a 3/2 life linker, trying to buffer his life total even further. Ty untaps the Bolas' Citadel looming in the background, and then plays a Vran Executioner's Thane, showing that the sacrifice shenanigans are not going to be stopping anytime soon. Ty then taps 5, speaking of sacrifice shenanigans, escapes his Woe Strider from the graveyard for the first time in this match, producing a 4/3 Woe Strider this time, along with a 0/1 goat. Ty then sacks the goat to the Woe Strider, triggering Catacomb Sifter and Vran and Zulaport Cutthroat. Buffering his life total and lowering John down to a near lethal amount. Ty then passes the turn back to John. John thinks for just a moment, stretches, flexes, pulls a card from off the top, about the best he could have asked for in the form of a Farewell. Ty takes a look at the Farewell, decides that he has many responses, sacrifices the Eldrazi token, triggering Vran, triggering Woe Strider, triggering Zulaport Cutthroat, triggering Catacomb Sifter, gaining him 3 life, losing John 3 life, giving Ty multiple scry triggers, but he decides he likes the card on top and he does not resolve any more scry triggers. He then sacks Vran to the Zulaport Cutthroat, gaining 1, losing 1. He then sacks Catacomb Sifter to the Zulaport Cutthroat, gaining 1, losing 1. He then sacks his Zulaport Cutthroat to the Woe Strider, gaining 1, John losing 1. All the while, John's life total just keeps ticking down, down, down. John names creatures and artifacts and graveyards with his Farewell, exiling just about every threat that he can possibly think of. John pluses, forgetting about the Hydra that is laying amongst Ty's lands, and Ty's going to activate it and swing in for lethal, settling the game.